A mother was found dead in her home under very unexplainable circumstances. This is a true crime that we'll be looking into today. This investigation is one that left even the police clueless. They kept running in circles with all the disturbing clues they had. Detectives and private investigators who also looked into the case experienced many unexpected twists, but as we all know, evil always reveals itself, and they eventually solved the case. Born in Houston, Texas on October 25, 1959, Kathy Martin grew up in a very loving home and was especially close to her sister. Kathy had the typical love story of meeting a boy in high school and falling head over heels for him. Mike, the boy in question, waited a few years after their graduation and proposed to Kathy, and they got married. They decided to stay in Houston and raise their family, and soon after the wedding, God blessed them with a beautiful girl. 3 years later, Kathy took in again, and in late January 1987, she gave birth to a boy. Shortly after the second child was born, Kathy, with consent of her husband, decided to become a full-time housewife, dedicating all her time to taking care of the kids, while Mike continued working at a small sign factory owned by Kathy's dad. Kathy was 27 at the time, and the family was doing pretty well since Mike made more than enough to provide for their children. Kathy's loving parents also supported them financially, making life easier for Kathy and her immediate family. Tragedy struck that same year on March 3rd, when after work, Mike decided to meet with his friends and have some drinks at the bar. He called his wife from a payphone to inform her that he was going to be a little late, but she didn't answer. This had never happened before, as the phone wouldn't even ring twice before his wife would respond. After all, she had nowhere else to be apart from being at home, taking care of the kids. He called about 4 more times and still got no response. That was when he became worried and decided to call their neighbor Tim and pleaded with him to check on Kathy. Tim hurried over to their home and knocked on the door, but he got no response. He peeped through the living room's window and saw that their TV set was on, so he knocked even louder, expecting someone to come get the door. But then again, no response. Tim grew anxious that something might have happened to Kathy. He took swift action and hopped into his car, driving around town to look for any patrol officers who might be on duty. He found a police car and quickly explained the situation to them, and they all hurried back to the house. The police, upon getting to the house, repeated the same process of knocking but also got no response. Meanwhile, Mike still kept calling his wife, trying to reach her. The policeman tried the door handle and found it to be unlocked. They got into the house, and the first thing they saw screamed at them that something had gone wrong. There lay Kathy's daughter on the living room sofa. They thought she was dead, but when they took a closer look, she was just unconscious, with so many bruises on her body, and frankly, she was minutes away from giving up the ghost. The police officers quickly called an ambulance and continued to inspect the house. They found the newborn baby in his crib, safe and sound, and when they went into the bedroom, the sight they saw brought tears to their eyes. They saw Kathy lying naked in a pool of her own blood, and without a doubt, there wasn't life in her anymore. They also noticed that her hands were tied with a lamp cord. The ambulance arrived, and paramedics immediately took Kathy's daughter to the hospital, while investigators and forensics began checking out the crime scene. Soon enough, Kathy's father arrived and wanted to go into the house, but the police officers didn't reveal the gory incident and just told him to go and be with his granddaughter in the hospital so she would see a familiar face when she woke up, and he complied. It was while waiting at the hospital that he saw the news report on TV about the demise of his beloved daughter. It was at this point that Mike arrived at the house, and his appearance carried this unexplainable vibe. Coupled with the fact that they questioned why he was just showing up since he must have heard the news hours ago, they noticed some stains on his shirt, which seemed very much like bloodstains. They immediately told him to hand over his clothes and took him for questioning. The investigators also began noticing strange things, like the bloodstains in the bathroom, a clear indication that the culprit did try to clean up the scene, but failed woefully. Forensics also found out that there was no sign of forced entry into the house, which also indicated that either Kathy willingly let the person in or the person had a spare key. This was becoming more intense as the minutes turned into hours. One of the investigators also noticed that all Kathy's clothes were neatly folded on the floor beside her lifeless body. This brought up a lot of questions. Was she trying to run away with her kids? Why was she naked? Was she sexually assaulted with the threat that if she screamed, they would harm her kids, only for her to comply and be killed afterwards? There were too many unanswered questions. Another tragedy hit Kathy's family when Kathy's daughter fell into a coma. The doctors were desperately fighting for her life, and they determined she had been seriously beaten, hit with bare hands with punches that were equivalent to the ones thrown in a street fight. Her chances of survival had significantly reduced. The doctors and medical experts also examined Kathy's body and discovered that she had received 16 stab wounds to her abdomen. They also confirmed that she was sexually assaulted and proceeded to retrieve biological material that may help them nail the culprit. But this was 1987, and DNA analysis was not as advanced as it is now, so experts had difficulty profiling the perpetrator from the DNA. The best they could do at that time was determine the blood type, so they sent the biological material to the lab. It would be good to note that the primary suspect and the person who had the focus and attention of everyone was Kathy's husband due to his very strange behavior. Apart from the blood stains on his shirt, they noted that it was indeed strange that after he realized he couldn't reach his wife, he didn't head home immediately, but instead reached out to his neighbor to go check on his wife. The detectives were very suspicious of him because this was not the first time they had seen such tactics, where the husband would commit a murder and get someone else to find the body so it isn't traced back to him as the one who discovered the body. The fact that there was no forced entry also backed up this claim. They began to investigate him and soon found that he had a criminal record. He was arrested right after high school for selling drugs to an undercover cop. He was sentenced to 6 years, but only served 2 because of good conduct and was released on parole. Sometime after that, he claimed to have turned over a new leaf and married Kathy. But the police couldn't pose him as the culprit just yet. They needed more solid evidence and began investigating Tim as well, wondering why he didn't call Mike or the police as soon as he suspected something was going on and instead went in search of patrol officers. They grew suspicious of Tim and started investigating his vehicle, which led them to find some stains on the floor of his car that looked like blood. This added Tim to the priority list of suspects alongside Mike, but it also brought about new questions that the investigators didn't exactly have answers to. Were they working together, or did one of them commit this crime alone? After thoroughly examining Kathy's body, medical experts reached a shocking conclusion. Their report stated that Kathy had died around 1 p.m., and this was 6 hours before she was found. So the police now had new grounds to start questioning Mike and Tim on where they were at the exact time of the murder, and both of them told the detectives they were at work. The police started looking deep into it to find out if there was any time they had the chance to commit the murder. Luck began to shine upon the detectives when 2 days later they received a call from the hospital telling them that Kathy's daughter had suddenly come out of the coma. The investigators were excited by this news and couldn't wait to see her to ask her some questions, but they were quickly disappointed when they found out that this 4-year-old was having difficulty remembering the face of the culprit. The only thing she could tell them was that the person had light hair, and this testimony, although being useful, would prove devastating to the detectives because both Mike and Tim had dark hair. Still, the investigators believed the young girl could have made an error due to the trauma of the incident and didn't rule out the 2 men as suspects just yet. They spoke to psychologists and asked them to further talk to the little girl to see if they could get more accurate information from her. The detectives hit another stone wall when they got a call from the lab telling them that the stains on the floor of Tim's vehicle were simply engine oil, and the stains on Mike's shirt were just paint. This was good, but devastating news for the detectives, as this could mean the men sincerely had nothing to do with the death of Kathy. Furthermore, after investigating and questioning the co-workers of both Mike and Tim, their alibis checked out, as the workers could prove that at the time of death, these two individuals were at work. The detectives had no choice but to go back to the drawing board and decide that they were going to speak with Kathy's family, relatives, and friends to find out who they thought might have committed the crime. Suddenly, there was a new suspect. Everybody they questioned had the same name roll off their mouths: Greg, Kathy's sister's husband. The family and relatives they asked told them that Kathy had told them that Greg openly flirted with her and tried many times to get her to sleep with him. It could be that, at the time, the family members didn't take it seriously, and Kathy herself didn't hammer on the situation, not wanting to cause a rift between her and her sister. But they all remembered how Kathy constantly complained about how Greg would make inappropriate comments about her stomach, and this was where the multiple stab wounds were located. The police started looking into this man called Greg, and soon found out that he had a criminal record and regularly used illegal substances. Forensics later discovered a fingerprint in Kathy's house that matched Greg's, but this wasn't enough to nail him since he was a frequent visitor to the house, and the fingerprint might have been from one of the times he visited. Kathy's parents were sure that Greg was the one who committed this atrocity, and the detective's suspicion grew even more when Kathy's mom shared some very interesting information about what happened in the hospital. She said that when Greg came to visit Kathy's daughter, the little girl looked very frightened upon seeing him. When he left, her grandmother asked her if that was the man who came to the house, but the little girl said she could not remember. Upon hearing this, the police invited Greg over for questioning, but he denied having any involvement with the murder. He claimed to be with a friend at the time of the murder, and his alibi was checked out. But this so-called friend also had a long history of criminal activity. Then something strange happened. Greg claimed that he needed to go and pay for extra time at the parking lot so that he would avoid getting a ticket, and they let him go, but he never came back to the station. The police decided to question his wife, Kathy's sister, who was more than happy to cooperate because she was sure it wasn't her husband who committed the murder. She told them that Greg dropped her off at work at 10:30 that morning and picked her up by 2:30 that same day. Maybe she didn't know, but this was an incriminating statement because that meant he had a 4-hour window to commit the murder and even clean up before going to pick her up. Their suspicion grew, but it was frustrating. They still couldn't find any evidence to nail this guy directly to the crime scene. The semen they took from Kathy's genitals could only provide the blood group, and they would need a much larger sample to be anywhere close to knowing the DNA. However, they conducted the test, and the blood group was exactly the same as Greg's blood group. But again, this was 1987, and the police felt it wasn't enough evidence to nail him, which is very disappointing if you ask me. Shelley, Kathy's sister, even with the thought that this man could actually be the one who murdered Kathy, refused to believe anything. It caused a rift between her and her family when she decided to continue living with the man who was her sister's supposed killer. And as sloppy as the killer was, the police let him go free because, I quote, "There was no evidence directly proving Greg's involvement." Sadly, the case hit a dead end. Detectives would revisit the case from time to time, and in 1998, 11 years from the year of the murder, when DNA analysis had at least gotten to a better state, they requested again for it to be tested. However, after all those years, it was difficult to even extract a partial DNA profile, and when they did, and compared it to Greg's DNA sample, it yielded inconclusive results. It showed that Greg belonged to the 2% of the population that could match the partial profile. Left to me, this was grounds to send this man to jail. All the evidence was already pointing to him, and if this were in 2024, Greg wouldn't see the light of day outside. But maybe he had supernatural lawyers, or the police were just too unserious. Quick question for our viewers. How many people out of the 2% of that population had their fingerprints found in the house? There, you have your answer. Still, they claimed that they were unable to arrest him based on this result, and they had to summon Greg one more time to the police station for questioning, using a different tactic this time and telling him DNA technology had advanced and the semen collected from the victim was a 100% match with his. Something happened that shocked everybody. Greg changed his initial statement, claiming that Kathy actually consented to sleeping with him, but he wasn't the one who murdered her because she was very much alive when he left the place. It's impossible to believe that even after this mighty reveal, Greg was still allowed to walk out of the station. The detectives claimed they didn't believe him because, according to Kathy's family, she complained bitterly about his sexual advances towards her, and so that it was very unlikely that out of the blue she would consent to a sexual relationship with him and even keep it a secret. Things got worse when the incompetent legal prosecutors told the officers and Kathy's family that obtaining a guilty verdict would practically be impossible without a full DNA match. Truly incompetent indeed, and sadly, the case once again went cold for many years until new hope was brought to life in 2002 when the detectives reopened the investigation and sought the help of forensic scientist Catherine Long. Catherine at the time was conducting groundbreaking research on DNA. She and her colleagues were determined to determine if genetic material from a culprit's hand could remain on the victim's body after strangulation and if it could be analyzed. They tested this in a comedic way by squeezing each other's necks. I would like to say that no scientists were harmed in the making of this video. Then they took samples from their hands and neck areas, and the results were way beyond exciting. It was found that even brief interaction would leave behind enough skin particles for DNA analysis. This was exactly what the detectives working on Kathy's case were looking for. Although it was impossible to re-examine the body, their brains started working this time around, and they began searching for any object or item that the culprit might have come in contact with. That was when they remembered the lamp cord used to tie Kathy's hands that had been taken in as evidence all those years ago. Luckily, the cord was stored in a paper bag to avoid contamination from air, which could tamper with the results. The cord was immediately sent to Catherine for examination, and she and her team spent a good amount of time carefully examining the entire cord from top to bottom. They made sure every single part of it was examined, and the results came in. They discovered 2 DNA profiles, the obvious one being Kathy's, and the second profile was a 100% match with Greg's DNA sample. Finally, the detectives had evidence to send him to jail. But what did they do? They still invited him for questioning, and he still denied being involved in any of it. While waiting for trial, he was put in prison, and this was the moment the universe decided enough was enough. One of the cellmates put a call into the detective, and what he told them sealed this case forever. He said that Greg had confessed to them in vivid, gory details. He said that Greg boasted about killing his wife's sister and proceeded to explain everything Greg claimed happened that day. He said he took illegal substances and went to Kathy's house. Greg attempted to coerce her into engaging in sexual intercourse with him, but she vehemently refused, and that was when he approached her 4-year-old daughter and dealt heavy blows and threatened to do the same to her son, which would end up killing him if she didn't comply. Kathy, who wanted to save the lives of her kids, agreed immediately, and he tied her up, sexually assaulted her, and when he was done, he killed her, stabbing her numerous times in her belly. The cellmate then added another detail, saying that Greg then went into the bathroom to wash the blood off himself, and he changed into her husband's clothes to avoid getting blood in his own car. Undoubtedly, the detectives knew there was no way the cellmate was lying, because how could he have gotten so many of the details correctly, even if he had seen it on the news? So, with this new information, the detectives confronted Greg one more time, and this time around, he confessed to it all, admitting to killing Kathy and repeating everything his cellmate had told the detectives. He finally pleaded guilty in 2004, and was sentenced to 45 years in prison, but was released after 4 years before dying of liver cancer at the age of 56. The saddest part of this all was that Kathy's husband didn't live to see justice for his wife's death. The pain must have been unbearable, and he passed away at the age of 45. The time it took for this case to be solved was unnecessary because everyone already knew who the killer was right from the moment it happened. It must have been especially painful for Kathy's parents as they watched their other daughter live with a murderer for all these years. There was nothing they could do about it. Kathy's daughter was an adult by the time justice was found for her mom, and although it took a long time, the family could be at peace knowing that Greg would never get the chance to show his sick face ever again. Please let us know what you think about this case in the comments section below. If you watched to this minute, I appreciate you. We will be producing such cases every week for you. Please make sure to subscribe and hit the like button for YouTube to push this video, and perhaps someone finds value in it.